In the last video, we studied the cranial arteries. Today we will see, staying within the liquid portion of the skull, the cranial venous system and sinuses. As we saw in the previous video on the meninges and intracranial membranes, the dural sinuses are venous channels that run between the endosteal and meningeal layers of the dura. They receive blood from the cerebral veins, through the bridging veins and cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space, that drains also the extracranial veins of the skull through the emissary veins and the diploic veins. A close relationship is thus created between the meninges and the intracranial venous system. The vast venous drainage of the brain can be grossly divided into two main systems. The superficial system comprising the superior sagittal sinus that occupies the upper fixed margin of the falx cerebri. It extends from the crista galli anteriorly and ends at the level of internal occipital protuberance posteriorly, where it deviates to one or other side, usually the right side, and becomes continuous with the corresponding transverse sinus. At this level, it becomes dilated and forms the confluence of sinuses. Along its course, the superior sagittal sinus receives the superior cerebral veins, diploic and meningeal veins through the lateral lacunae, and pericranial veins passing through parietal foramina. The superficial middle cerebral vein, also known as the sylvian vein, anteriorly, it runs forwards to drain into the cavernous sinus, while posteriorly, it interacts together with the superior sagittal sinus via superior anastomotic vein of Trolard, and with the transverse sinus via inferior anastomotic vein of Labbè. So, the superior anastomotic vein of Trolard, connects the superior sagittal sinus and the superficial middle cerebral vein of Sylvius. In the inferior anastomotic vein of Labbè, connects the superficial middle cerebral vein, sylvian vein, to the anterolateral portion of the transverse sinus. The superficial middle cerebral vein is located superficially in the lateral sulcus. The inferior sagittal sinus runs in the posterior half or 2/3 of the free margin of the falx cerebri. At the level of the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli, it joins the great cerebral vein of Galen, a deep vein to form the straight sinus. It receives veins from the falx and few veins from the medial surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. The straight sinus is formed by the union of inferior sagittal sinus and great cerebral vein of Galen. It runs postero-inferiorly in the junction between falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli and ends posteriorly into the left, or sometimes the right, transverse sinus. It receives some superior cerebellar veins. The transverse sinuses start at the internal occipital protuberance, one as a continuation of superior sagittal sinus and the other as a continuation of straight sinus. They run on the fixed margins of the tentorium cerebelli and mark a groove on the occipital and parietal bones. They end by turning inferomedially to form the sigmoid sinuses. The transverse sinuses receive inferior cerebral, inferior cerebellar, diploic, and inferior anastomotic veins. The sigmoid sinuses are S-shaped sinuses that begin as direct continuation of the transverse sinuses, which turn inferomedially as they leave the tentorium to enter the mastoid groove on the mastoid part of the temporal bone. Then, it turns anteriorly and then inferiorly, where it enters the posterior part of the jugular foramen, to become continuous with the internal jugular vein at the superior jugular bulb. The deep venous or galenic system that mainly comprises the great vein of Galen, the internal cerebral veins, the basal vein of Rosenthal, and the inferior and superior sagittal sinuses with their tributaries. The great cerebral vein, also known as the vein of Galen or great vein of Galen, is a short valvulus midline venous trunk that drains the deep parts of the cerebrum, brainstem, and parts of the posterior cranial fossa. It begins superior to the pineal gland by the union of two pairs of veins, internal cerebral veins and basal veins of Rosenthal. The internal cerebral veins are paired, paramedian veins which course posteriorly along the roof of the third ventricle. The basal veins, also known as the paramedian basal veins or veins of Rosenthal, are paired, paramedian veins which originate on the medial surface of the temporal lobe and run posteriorly and medially. The cavernous sinuses are a pair of boat-shaped dural envelopes that are located on each side of the body of the sphenoid bone. It has 4 walls, medial, lateral, superior, and posterior. The anterior narrow part is located at the supraorbital fissure, while the posterior wide part, lies lateral to the dorsum sella. Its posterior wall shares its dural lining with the lateral part of the posterior wall of the basilar sinus, which extends behind the dorsum sella and forms the main communication between the two cavernous sinuses. The superior and inferior petrosal sinuses also open in the lateral part of the basilar sinus, and thus creating a venous confluence. The cavernous sinus mainly drains the orbit by the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins, the retina by the central retinal vein, the cerebral hemispheres by the middle and inferior cerebral veins, the dura by tributaries of the middle meningeal veins, and the sphenoparietal sinus. It empties posteriorly into the transverse sinus, via the superior petrosal sinus, and into the jugular venous bulb, via the inferior petrosal sinus and a plexus of veins associated with the internal carotid artery. The superior petrosal sinus arises from the postero-superior part of the cavernous sinus and course on the attached margins of tentorium cerebelli until it empties into the transverse sinus. The superior petrosal sinus receives cerebellar, inferior cerebral, and tympanic veins. The inferior petrosal sinus passes through the anteromedial part of the jugular foramen and joins the jugular venous bulb on either side. The jugular vein, it is formed by the union of inferior petrosal and sigmoid dural venous sinuses in or just distal to the jugular foramen, forming the jugular bulb. After receiving tributaries from the face and neck, it continues to descend before descending into the thorax, usually posterior to the space between the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, before uniting with the subclavian vein to form the brachiocephalic vein. From above, we can see the confluence of the sinuses. The transverse sinuses that terminate in the sigmoid sinus, just as it receives the superior petrosal sinus from the cavernous sinus. In turn, the sigmoid sinuses continue as the jugular bulbs in the skull base. We can also see the inferior petrosal sinus, which drains blood from the cavernous sinus, and the superior petrosal sinus that courses posterolaterally to drain into the sigmoid sinus at the continuation of the transverse sinus. The basilar plexus that serves to connect the two inferior petrosal sinuses and the cavernous sinus that is located on either side of the pituitary fossa and body of the sphenoid bone. It receives venous blood from inferior and superior ophthalmic veins, intercavernous sinus, superficial middle cerebral vein. If we focus on the cavernous sinus, we can see that several anatomical structures, including some cranial nerves and their branches, also passes through the sinus, as oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, ophthalmic and maxillary branches of trigeminal nerve traversing the sinus, the abducens nerve, internal carotid artery accompanied by the internal carotid plexus, then the pituitary gland that lies between the two paired cavernous sinuses. Here we can see how the superior orbital fissure gives passage to the oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, ophthalmic nerve, abducens nerve. The optic nerve lies just above and outside the cavernous sinuses superior and lateral to the pituitary gland on each side and enters the orbital apex via the optic canal. The foramen rotundum allows for the passage of the maxillary nerve, 5-2, a branch of the trigeminal nerve, and finally the foramen ovale that transmits the mandibular nerve. If you want to learn more about aspects related to this topic, I recommend these videos.